YouTube is awake. It always wakes up last. It's always the last to wake up. It's always the up. Internet, we're here. Internet, we have arrived. And I am excited to say that. And I'm saying we. Why am I saying we? Because I have a guest today. Guys, you know that recently here at Get Your News On with Ron, we started the Sounds of Revolution interview series. That's a series where I interview different creative types, musicians, authors, activists, free thinkers, whatever it may be. And I interview them about what they want in 2020 and what they want just kind of down the pipeline. I think I'm going to continue this post-election because I really enjoy it. So yeah, but we're going to talk about 2020 now because it is upon us. And my guest today, I am super excited to have this guy. I really like what he's doing. He is a writer. He has written the novels. His novels include Bash Bash Revolution, Billy Moon, and After the Saucers Landed. He works at Zero Books, which is a cool publisher based in the UK, actually, but they also got presence here in the United States of America, and he hosts the Zero Squared podcast. Please welcome to the show, Douglas Lain. Douglas, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you. So we'll get right into it. I've watched a lot of the interviews that you've been in. So I've heard some of your thoughts out there. You said this in an interview, and it really struck me. You said that in 2008, when pretty much the financial collapse happened and the housing market went to garbage, you looked around and you kind of thought, hey, the Marxists were right. Can you embellish on that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it wasn't like I looked around immediately and realized it. It was a process. In fact, I started to podcast on my own. I mean, now I podcast for Zero Books, but I used to do it on my own. And I was podcasting partly to try to discover just what was going on. It seemed cataclysmic. The 2008 crisis seemed very threatening. At the time, I was working for Comcast in a job that I really hated. I was in a phone center making calls, and it felt like my prospects for other possibilities of employment were dwindling as the economy was dropping. I had a Billy Moon, that first novel that you mentioned, was like in the works, and at the same time, like half of New York publishing were fired around 2008. So it was like I felt like maybe this writing career that I had been pursuing wasn't going to come to fruition because of the economic crisis as well. And I really wanted to know just why it had happened and what we could expect to come out of it. I was already far on the left. I was like a Chomsky anarchist type. You know, I'd read Adbusters magazine and go to protests against U.S.
You were already on a list somewhere. You were already
I was already on a list, but I wasn't a Marxist because I'm probably a bit older than most of the people on the left now. I mean, I definitely am. I need to accept how old I am. I'm like Jimmy Dore here. I'm in my late 40s, and so I was raised. I came up in a time when the Cold War was still going on. And Marx was just off the table. You just didn't, you might say, because I was sort of an anarchist type in the Pacific Northwest. So you might say, oh yeah, Marx had some good critiques of capitalism, but he was an authoritarian and he was nasty and we don't really look at him. But I started podcasting and inviting economists on, left economists on, to try to figure out what was going on with the economic crisis. And it was that process of interviewing a bunch of people over a few years that transformed me into kind of a rad lib anarchist, into what I called for a long time and still say occasionally is a wannabe Marxist. So what that means is I'm not done reading Marx. I'm not done trying to understand the Marxist project.
There's a lot of volumes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of volumes to Capital.
Yeah, I've read Capital Volume 1 and not 2 and 3. I shouldn't confess this on the air, but it's a fact. And I've read a bunch of other Marxist texts, and I'm slowly kind of continuing my education to try to figure out just what the socialist project is, what the history of socialism is, and how it's become distorted over time as well.
So what specifically, when it came to housing, like what were those lefty economists saying where you were like, oh, yeah, this is what we should be doing?
Well, the main thing that I became convinced about wasn't so much about the incidents that sparked the recession or almost depression, the economic crisis of 2008, but the theories or the explanations of the underlying causes. So what I became convinced of was that there's a tendency for the rate of profit to decline as we innovate in a capitalist economy, that the speed up of production actually works against itself overall. And as the commodities become cheaper, profitability goes down, which can lead to a variety of things. It's led to lots of attempts to compensate, for instance, financialization or other kinds of speculative bubbles. But nonetheless, that is the inherent weakness of a capitalist economy, is that it is crisis prone because it has a tendency to turn its success into its failure. And then, unfortunately for us, also to turn its failure into success. When you have a massive depression, capital becomes cheaper and reinvestment and profitability becomes more of a possibility. So it's not that the capitalist economy will go into some sort of terminal crisis and then we'll get socialism. It's that basically it will go into crisis and then there'll be a boom and then there'll be a crisis. And the human beings suffer, but the capitalist economy is just operating like it should. That's how it works.
Well, and a few people at the top never suffer, and so the process continues, and it's one of those things, like when you really take a step back and you realize, oh, we made an entire economy based on consumption, not consumption out of necessity, not even consumption out of necessity and for a quality of life, which there's nothing wrong with either of those things. Both those things are good things. But consumption out of this is how the economy works, that takes it to a whole other level. And it's just inherently going to self-destruct every so often.
One of the things about reading Marx and becoming a Marxist is that you become, in my case, a reluctant pedant. So I want to say that it's not a matter of our economy isn't primarily based on consumption, but on exchange. Because when you think about consumption, most of the time people think about, individuals, workers going to the store and buying things that they then consume for themselves. But what a huge portion of our economy is based on is exchanges between capitalists themselves. So you can have the exchange of productive commodities. It's the, you buy a computer and you use it at work. You buy steel and you make machinery to then create tools for mining, which then you use to create steel, to use to create tools, to create more mining. I mean, there's a whole realm of production which is really just aimed at expanding capital and not necessarily providing for human needs at all. The consumer side of the economy is, for me, I think the one thing that might recommend capitalism is that, we can produce a lot of cheap stuff that most people, at least maybe a widening circle of people, can afford, and that's the upside. The downside is that state of affairs isn't permanent, and the whole system is driven in a way to create inequality and crisis. But it's this production for exchange more than the production for consumption, because all human production is aimed at human consumption on one level or another. That's not the main thing. It's the fact that rather than production for use in a community, we're producing things that we want to get rid of, and the primary goal is profitability and through exchange.
Right.
Yeah.
So how would you define socialism?
It's difficult because there's different definitions. I don't really distinguish in my head between socialism and communism. What I would say is that socialism is the overcoming of a mode of production for exchange and the self-emancipation of working people. In other words, the working class would eliminate its own position. There would no longer be a class of people who had nothing to sell but their time as workers, and another class that would own everything or the means of production. And instead, we would compete with each other maybe to be productive. The aim would be to have a society where the primary want in life is to contribute, to be not just a worker, but to be a fully engaged creative subject in the world that has some say over what's produced, what the direction of the collective humanity is going to be, but also a sense of yourself and your own creative powers.
Yeah,
but that's very abstract, maybe. But, but
well, it's really tough. I mean, people. I try not to subscribe to any one ist as a self-descriptor, but it's like some of these terms are helpful for a starting point, even though there's a lot of there's so many flexibilities within them. I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, look, anarchy itself. I mean, anarchy is a lot like ice cream. There's so many different flavors. You're going to find something you like.
Right.
But in socialism, very similar as well. I've said that if I had to describe myself as one thing, if you're like, well, pick one thing that you would say is closest to where you're at, I would say market socialist would describe me the most. However, that's not necessarily all encompassing, because what I mean by that is, like, I think workers should own the means of production. However, you can still have some individuals participating in, the goods and services part of the economy. Like if Joe Schmo wants to start a restaurant, I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's a good thing. People want to innovate. They want to contribute something. And if Joe Schmo's restaurant sucks, it might not stay open. If it's good, it might stay open. However, when Joe Schmo hires workers, they get a seat at the table. They, they cooperate with each other and they get a voice. But where I don't think that, a market socialism thing would work is in housing. I think housing should be totally orchestrated. It should be a human right. I am in principle against private property, although that's not a change I'm going to see in my lifetime. So it's not like that's something I'm very adamant about. But if I was starting a society from scratch, I don't think private property is something I would include in it. But
well, I mean, I'm right now, I'm wrestling in my mind as to whether to threaten to send you to Siberia or to make, some sort of gesture of comradeship. I think what I'll do is the second thing and say, there's another definition of socialism, which is socialism is a transition between the capitalist order we know now and society where the maxim from each according to their ability to each according to their need would hold. So what I would say is that I can imagine that it is least plausible that on the way towards what I'll call socialism or a communist society, we might still hold with some kinds of exchanges which would seem like what we already have now. But I'm not against people running restaurants for people to come to and eat. What I'm opposed to is the idea that our productive work, the value of our productive work is measured in labor time and creates these commodities which are then valued based on the labor time, or their prices are in a roundabout way determined by that. So in other words, the problem with the exchange side of in the market isn't the market itself. It's the productive apparatus that's necessary and the social relationship that defines capitalism that's necessary in order for that market to obtain. You have to have a system in place where production is aimed at creating commodities which then kind of embody the amount of time, the average time spent working. And that requires there to be a class of people who have nothing to sell but their time as workers in order to create that kind of exchange in the market. So what I would like to see is a common hoard where in the market to have the kind of the quality where you go and you pick out things that you need or that you want to work with in order to contribute to society, but it's not a profit-driven market. But that's, the long-term vision. Workers' co-ops, small scale,
right.
Work, and maybe some nationalization under capitalism. Maybe all of those things could be steps on the road towards my more utopian vision.
Well, so what specifically is your utopian vision then?
Well, specifically, this is where it gets. I like to talk in big abstract terms. Specifically, well, I do have a dystopian vision, Bash Bash Revolution, in which capitalism is replaced by an AI. But the what I would say primarily my vision is that we would create forms of cooperation in production, which are based on cooperation, and where the production is aimed at providing for human needs rather than aimed at producing this kind of abstract value that our profits come out of. I mean, it could be, and I think it's likely that even money would no longer be necessary in a socialist world. That there would be other forms of there might be other forms that we would use to determine our cooperation, but it wouldn't be something that we would spend in a market to get goods. We might have a social credit system that would give us the power to direct other people's activity, and say, okay, everybody has to come work on my project now because everyone's voted for this project, which I want to create. Let's say I want to explore outer space, so everyone has to lump in because everyone voted, so it's your turn to come make the microchips for the spaceship or something like that. So that would be my vision. My vision would not be a small vision. It would be a radical transformation of society.
Well, I started off my year reading. Have you ever read the book Debt?
Yeah, by what's it, David Graeber.
Yeah. He's an anarchist academic, right? Like that's kind of his background. Yeah, I started off my year reading that book, and I was just like, oh wow, like just so many little things in there that you just never think about as you just participate in society. That really breaks down, like the history of money and why we have it, and what exactly it does, and how it's like. I mean, just within the first couple of pages where he's like, look, as an individual, you have this, you're always taught this moral thing, like you owe your debt this like morality that you have to honor it. Yet that's not reciprocated at all, because debt is just this amoral thing that never goes away, no matter what happens on your end. And that's it's really absurd when you think about it. Yeah, it's really absurd what the banks were able to do, but we're born into this stuff. So we just don't, we don't really ask these questions. But then when you break it down, it's like, oh, there's gotta be a better way to, in the most simple sense, there's gotta be a better way to exchange.
Yeah. One thing that I read when I was reading Capital recently, because I have a Capital Volume 1 reading group, because I'm reading it again to try to understand it better. That really hit home was that gold under a capitalist system is a way to have social power and to hold on to the social promise of access and into the collective work. In other words, the reason people hoard gold is not because the gold in and of itself is so valuable, but because it works as a universal social promise of that people will do what you ask them to do. It's a hoarding of social power. The gold. So the thing to understand about capitalism is that we conceive of the relationships in the market and the economic realm as being kind of objective and out there. Gold is gold; it has value. But really, it only has value from because of the social relationships that it engenders and that have produced it. So the person holds gold in order to ensure his social safety, right? And now we live in a world where capitalists spend their money in productive activity in order to grow their social power. And so rather than debt, I tried to think about as the only category. I tried to think about how, creating debt and also creating a surplus of gold, creating lots of profits are both forms of trying to hold on to social power. So
let's switch gears and talk about book publishing.
Okay.
I wanted to get into that before we dive into 2020. You know, when you were mentioning 2008, I was having flashbacks myself because I was actually working in book publishing just as a freelance editor myself at that time. And what happened was work dried up so much that, you know, I eventually just I ended up going to grad school actually in the short term, and then just kind of was only focused on stand-up and what have you. But so how did you kind of you had a regular day job and you were writing, and then you eventually started working with Zero Books, you know, at a time where the publishing industry was taking a lot of hits, and I'd imagine still is. So can you unpack some of that history for me?
Sure. Well, okay. I did podcasting, and I continued to write fiction, and I am still, you know, I haven't written fiction in a couple of years now, since 2018. I have to write again. But I did that for a while. I started my podcast in 2009. I had my first short story collection published in 2006. My very first professional short story was published in 1999. I've been working as a short story writer and then as a novelist through all that time. And, you know, I had the dream of being a professional fiction writer, but I had to work a regular jobs as I went along. Then I did the podcast for about 5 years on my own. And around 2014, the people who were running Zero Books for John Hunt Publishing, which is a company that owns all these different imprints, quit. And those people include Mark Fisher and Tariq Goddard as the two primary people who were in charge of the imprint. They quit. They went off to form their own imprint with a new company. There was a lot of bad blood there, and the people at John Hunt Publishing were looking around for someone to take their place. And because I had been interviewing a lot of leftist academics for my own podcast, one of my guests, David Blacker, said, "Hey, this position's opened up. You should apply for it." So I did. What
was the position specifically?
The publishing manager, which is the job I have now. So it's actually a freelance position. It's not I don't own stock in the company. I don't own the press. I don't even have a contract. I get paid month to month. But they love me, so I'm not concerned about job security. But so I'm the publishing manager for Zero Books, and I got hired in a process where they hired a Brit first, but because of the people who had left were so upset that the imprint was going to go on without them. I think they thought if they left, it would die. And they were giving the Brit who got hired a lot of trouble online. And so he quit after 2 days. And so I was their second choice. And I, as an American, was not influenced by the London Radlib scene. And so I took the job, and I've been there for about 5 years now, coming up on 5 years.
And you've published with them as well, correct?
I haven't. No,
I had a book. Different. I know a couple of your novels. I didn't realize all your novels were with different.
No, I haven't published any of my novels with Zero Books. It's mostly a critical theory.
Okay.
We do publish some. I'm thinking I might start doing that because I couldn't get published with Nightshade Books, although I don't know if I could because they've changed editors there. But because it would give me the freedom to really spend time working as both a publicist on my own material and as the writer. And
sure.
Whereas now what I do is there's some publicist and some other company working on it, and I focus on my own publicist work because I'm the publishing manager and I'm a publicist for Zero Books. So I feel like, hey, I could try this out and see how well I could do if I was in charge of all the marketing for my own material. I don't know if it would be a disaster or not. But yeah, no, I haven't published for Zero Books at all. I had a contract with them for a nonfiction book, which is why it was sort of on their list. But once I got hired on, I didn't ever write the book.
Oh, okay.
So I still will actually eventually write a nonfiction book for Zero Books. I'm thinking of writing a book on socialism that would be based on Marx's critique of the Gotha program, but it would be critique of new socialism and be aimed at Bhaskar Sankar and Nathan Robinson and all of my friends. I thought it would be a great way to alienate the social democratic movement that is taking charge of the left, but just actually to put it out there as not a slam on the kind of social democratic movements that we have, but as pointing to what might lay beyond that horizon.
So, well, this is going to transition into 2020 now then, but one real quick question before we go there, staying with book publishing. So kind of like just a nuts and bolts, what is necessary? Because there's a lot of publishing houses that I'm a huge fan of, like PM Press, Research. I like what Zero Books is doing, and I think AK, like there's so many presses out there that I think are just keeping these ideas alive and are just publishing important things. And I can only imagine what it takes for a book publisher, for an independent book house, to stay afloat these days. So
our profit margins are really small. I mean,
okay.
We are, I'm not going to give you the exact number, but
sure. Yeah.
But we make less in profit than Joe Biden just spent in his last ad buy. So, which was 6 figures. So it's less than that, our profit margin, but that doesn't mean that we don't, so we're in the black, but, not by a lot. But what I found is that what makes Zero Books successful, and by the way, as the imprints for John Hunt Publishing go, we are the most successful imprint overall. I mean, more than the New Age stuff, more than the pagan stuff, because they do a lot of different kinds of things, more than the Christian presses that they've got. It's this far left kooky Marxist venture that's the most profitable. So that tells you something about the climate right now. And the way I focus on the imprint is now to think about how books will work both with, as with readers, and what the most important thing to put forward there is, but also how to intervene in the digital left at the same time. So, I'm going to be publishing a book by Michael Brooks, for instance, and that was just a very obvious move to make because he's got enough of a platform and such a strong enough voice on the left that I know people will want to read his book, as they should. But then at the same time, along with that, we're running these books that are much more maybe academic or rarefied. One of my favorite books has never sold very well. Is called The Writing on the Wall by Anselm Jappe. It's all about value theory and the limits of bourgeois politics. And, I'm thinking about publishing a book by Rick Kuhn, who's an expert on Heinrich Grossman. I just had him on a live stream. Heinrich Grossman was a Marxist of a certain kind of economistic type. He was accused of being mechanistic in his thinking. I think that was totally unfair, but sort of was cast out of the Frankfurt School. So those are the kinds of things I love to put out alongside books that are maybe more accessible, and also maybe just as important, like give them an argument about Ben Burgess, which is about how the left needs to re-embrace logic and steer clear of just being kind of shaming emotional types. We had a big success with Kill All Normies, which was came in right after Trump got elected. So it was about the alt-right and the failure of the radical liberal center to squelch a really frightening reactionary movement around Trump and beyond.
Well, so when you say you're embracing the digital age by, like getting to people that have digital platforms or, embrace ideas pertaining to the digital world and stuff like that, does that also include as far as just formats of the content itself, like audiobooks and stuff like that?
Well, eventually. We're still working on getting our audiobook line going. We're hoping this year to introduce Ben Burgess's book as our first audiobook. Look, the problem is that our profit margin is so small. Investing in producing an audiobook without knowing that it would make get additional sales rather than just split the sales that we're already getting, amongst different formats. It's sort of cost prohibitive. So the only way to do it is sort of on the fly. Like I might be one of the readers, or I might get one of the authors to be one of the readers, and then produce it with our own computers to get it on Audible and see how that works. And so then the problem is time.
Sure.
Rather than hiring, because there are lots of really good companies that aren't that expensive that will produce an audiobook for you, and you can turn to them, and they've got real talents as readers and such, but it's just a little bit out of our price range at the moment. So there's another reason why people should support us on Patreon to get those audiobooks.
So let's get to 2020 then. So what are you, Douglas Lain, hoping for in 2020? We got an election coming up.
Well, I have to confess that despite my sectarian Marxism, I have become a Bernie bro. I consider myself to be part of the online horde. That is
me too.
Yeah, yeah. I am definitely hopeful about the prospects of a Sanders nomination and then a Sanders victory. I don't have utter confidence that that's in the bag. I think that that beating Trump is going to be harder than anyone might anticipate, even for someone like Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think that Bernie and I think Bernie would beat Trump. I don't think it would be like a landslide by any means, but not only do I think that Bernie, could definitely beat Trump, I think he is the only candidate who has a chance.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I don't know how good that chance is. And I looked at the Corbyn. I thought Corbyn was going to beat Boris Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he lost it was a historic loss for the Labor Party. So that did give me pause. I mean, we don't have the same conditions here that they had there. Brexit isn't weighing down the Sanders campaign. I think Sanders is a better candidate than Corbyn was.
I think Sanders is more popular than Jeremy Corbyn was overall. I mean, in many ways, like the parallels there, but Sanders is more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. And I think a lot of it would kind of diminish Corbyn wasn't Corbyn's ideas. It was all the cowtailing he had to do to labor, which, labor itself wasn't particularly popular. And because they didn't have that cohesion, they didn't really pull off a victory.
I worry that the Russiagate stuff is going to hurt him, not because people are going to think he's Putin's puppet, but because he's going to seem to waffle about his acceptance of that narrative. Like on the one hand, he's going to try to brush it off as irrelevant, which I think it is, and on the other hand, he might try to posture as a warrior against Putin and take these stories more seriously than they warrant. I sort of think Tulsi Gabbard was right about it's really the U.S. intelligence community and not Russia that's interfering in our election when they push these kinds of stories.
I fully agree with that. I agree with everything you just said. And what I wish she would have done is I wish she just would have been like, it's okay if you're going to say like the diplomatic presidential thing that like, oh, foreign interference, that's not a good thing. We don't want that in our elections. All right. That's fine. The general voter likes hearing that stuff. That's cool. But then all you have to do is just be like, gee, it's kind of weird. If Putin loves Trump so much and if Russia loves Trump so much, why are they also helping out me, the guy who polls best against Trump? Maybe, just maybe, this is all just fluff. Say that in a flowery presidential way.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And but overall, I am very hopeful about Sanders' possibilities here and for there to be a kind of a resurgence of social democratic leftist politics in America. And I see my job as trying to figure out how those kinds of changes in American politics could help a deeper socialist project. I don't think it's at all, we can't take it for granted that getting Medicare for all is just an obvious stepping stone on the way to overcoming the value form, as I would put it, or overcoming the exploitation of workers, to put it more kind of.
But it's definitely a nice step. I mean, it's definitely a nice step because something like Medicare for all, you take away a lot of people are tethered to very exploitive jobs because they need it for their health care.
I just look around to Europe and see that has existed for quite a long time.
Sure.
And the capitalist class still has a stranglehold. And, I talked to leftists in Sweden, for instance, who are talking about how neoliberalism has had its way, even in Sweden. I mean, it's different. They do have a deeper social safety net, but nonetheless, there's still poverty. There's still problems with immigration. There's still many ways in which the Swedish state oppresses working class movements, let alone the rise of overturning capitalism.
Sure.
So it's a complicated, it's not going to be.
Yeah. It's not like, oh, we've gotten utopia because now everyone, but
Right.
It's like it's a
The
big
struggle
thing.
Continues even after Bernie.
Right. Well, and even if we, like I always tell people, I'm like, okay, if Bernie gets cheated again, of course it's yellow vest time. If Bernie doesn't get cheated again, we're too loud that they can't stifle us this time, and he goes on and he wins the nomination. We get to celebrate for 2 days, then it's yellow vest time. I mean, Bernie's only going to be as effective as the movement that's behind him, because he is going to face opposition in Congress. He's going to face opposition from the media. He's going to face opposition from the military industrial complex. Like, he's going to have to be able to point to us. He's going to be able to have to point to the people and be like, this is what we want to get done. And that's the only way it's going to be an effective presidency.
Well, I totally agree with you. I do think that if he wins the nomination, rather than yellow vests, we might want to put on suits and ties and go out and try to. but nonetheless,
maybe we need a little bit of both. We might need a little bit of both.
All right. But I am 100% behind you that not only is it important to continue to be active in order to go beyond the social democratic horizon, just to achieve the Medicare for all, or the elimination of Taft-Hartley, or getting rid of the card check, or a dozen different really nice programs and policies. He will need to have a lot of support, and I don't think we can expect it until after that he'll actually be able to accomplish quite a lot of what he does, until after there's some sort of change at the ballot box again in a midterm election. I think that he's going to spend the first 2 years fighting his own party and the Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, he might be able to do some things by executive order, but we will have to, continue to transform the Democratic Party after he gets elected.
Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, he'll be able to do some things by executive order. And also in the meantime, he'll be able to just kind of point the finger and be like, okay, these are some of the people holding this up. These are some of the Democrats that aren't for Medicare for all. These are some of, and just sort of like, all right, we gotta try to get these people out of office. and we need to, I think that we really need to act locally too, because I really feel like the type of change we need can only happen one community at a time.
Can we pretend that we're on the Jimmy Dore show for just a minute? Because here's what I want to say.
I suppose.
Do you know what the hell is going on with these blue check marks, these media establishment types who are they just, did they get some sort of brain rot? Do you get over $1 million a year and you lose IQ points? Because it seems to me like right now, what they ought to be doing is embracing Bernie Sanders.
Sure.
They ought to not be exposing themselves this way. If they want to rein him in, this is a time to come in for the clinch and say, "Oh, you're one of our boys after all."
Mm-hmm. Why do you think they're not doing that?
I don't know. This is what I'm asking you. Look, I'm just a dipshit comedian. I don't know.
I think it's that I mean, first of all, like, I think a lot of people in the corporate media are just there because they're just really good at reading a prompter. I think Chuck Todd. I think calling Chuck Todd a reporter is funnier than anything any comedian could ever write. I mean, I think that guy is a C-level actor who does a very good, or at least a good enough job playing a newscaster. That's exactly what he is. I don't think he's ever had an original thought go through his head. I don't think he's ever, been able to form an opinion without a note card in front of him telling him what to read or what to do.
Well, what about these people who are on Twitter with the blue check marks that are actually writing things, that they don't just read the teleprompters, but they write like essays.
These things? Who pays?
Yeah, I know. Oh, I know. Yeah.
It's just, they will publish the most ridiculous, they being, the New York Times, the Washington Post, if you want to smear Bernie, there is absolutely no, journalistic. They've published stuff smearing Bernie where the source was just a couple anonymous people claiming they heard a conversation, i.e. the Liz Warren fiasco. So really, if you want an opportunity in the corporate media, smearing Bernie is still your ticket to a big paycheck, whereas embracing Bernie is kind of your ticket to, getting fired or just having to build a big following on your own independently. Ed Schultz got fired just for wanting to cover Bernie. That climate has not changed at all. So I would say that's why these corporate mouthpieces aren't embracing Bernie Sanders. That's not who signs the paycheck. It doesn't matter that that's where public opinion is. And that's why, our media structure shouldn't be legal.
Right. I think that the other side of it, though, is like the DNC and the Democratic establishment. And I, again, look at like Tom Perez or even Elizabeth Warren and say, why aren't you guys figuring it out that the best way to beat Bernie Sanders is to play politics with him when he's in power rather than to expose yourself as corrupt, during the primary process, right? Rather than a brokered convention, which will just destroy your own party and really put you on the outs in the not even the long term, but like the near long term.
Do you think if it happens, if they steal he wins, the popular vote and they steal the nomination from him anyway via the second ballot where the superdelegates kick in? Do you think if that happens, that would be the end of the Democratic Party?
I think it will very likely create a significant enough split that the Democratic Party as it is will have real difficulties getting people elected for a long time, and that it will create a space for some sort of new social democratic party. I think that's likely. I also think that these people are chicken. They're all talk and they're no action. There's no way that they're actually going to do this in do a brokered convention. They'd have to some of them would actually have to take a personal political hit.
Well, do you think it's fair to say that their first priority isn't necessarily win? By they, I mean the Democratic establishment, the Tom Perez's, the Nancy Pelosi's, the people you've been mentioning. Is it fair to say that their first priority isn't winning? Because that's what I say. I say their first priority, and by the way, there's clips on MSNBC where people basically say this in not so many words. Their first priority
no doubt about it, that they would. I mean, beating Trump isn't even the primary problem with brokered convention. Obviously, if a brokered convention and putting up, I don't know, who are they talking about? Michelle Obama?
That was the thing this morning. Yeah, it was Sherrod Brown, right? Like he was gonna.
Yeah.
Michelle was gonna be the VP.
I mean, obviously that's not gonna happen. But even if it's like someone a little bit more realistic, like I don't know, they give it to Mitt Romney. No, sorry, I'm thinking of 2016. But they give it to some sort of in the back. John Kerry. Let's say they just bring John Kerry in, who was thinking about running anyway, and they give it to none of the candidates, or they give it to Biden. That seems very unlikely given Biden's mental state. But let's say that they gave it to Biden. There's no chance at all that whoever comes out that way is going to be able to beat Trump. Trump will use that, will set that on fire, hang that around their neck, and walk through till November. He will definitely beat any candidate that comes out of that brokered convention.
Big time. That's why I said their first priority is not winning. Their first priority is making the donors happy. So it's like, well, why aren't they joining Bernie Sanders? Well, they want to make the donors happy.
Right.
But they want to keep that gravy train flowing.
Yeah. But I mean, by 2024, will there be much of a Democratic Party left for people to donate to? You can end up in Biden's position where you're just not viable anymore, and that money dries up for another reason. So I don't know. I think it's very dumb for them to be publicly talking about a brokered convention this way, but
So they're in between a rock and a hard place then, where it's like, well, if we kind of join Bernie Sanders, we're really going to make the donor class upset, and we're really going to kind of disrupt our apple cart and our way of doing business, because it would be better for us to just lose to Trump again. When you think about it. However, on the same note, now our mask is kind of off, and people are kind of seeing us for what we are. So what we face the danger of doing what we just described in the short term, when the long term, we might not have a leg to stand on anymore.
Right. But I think they have to what they're underestimating, I think, ultimately, is the American public and the constituency behind Bernie Sanders. They think, because it wasn't so long ago.
Are you implying Tom Perez and his people don't have their thumb on the pulse of the American people?
Yeah, that's right.
You're a traitor, Douglas.
Well, but it wasn't very long ago the Democratic Party kind of played these backroom deals and brokered conventions on the regular.
Sure.
It wasn't until after 1968 that there was a move towards making the primary process more democratic. And I was watching a clip from an old Dunes. Who's the guy who did Doonesbury? An old series about the primaries called Tanner 88. You remember? Have you ever heard of this show?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so it was on HBO.
You probably give me a good list of stuff that I need to check out, especially in like the sci-fi world.
The old guys remember the 80s.
You're hip to subgenres that I am just not hip to.
Well, Tanner was
sci-fi and stuff like that. Like, I'm just not hip to a lot of that stuff, and I'd like to be.
Well, Tanner was not a science fiction thing. It was like a mock documentary about the campaign trail in 1988, following a fictional primary candidate in the Democratic primaries called Tanner. And the gimmick of it was he would actually go to the states where primaries were happening and mingle with the other candidates as if he was really one of them. And they filmed on the convention floor and all of that. And in that documentary, Tanner got enough delegates that he was trying to broker the convention to get Jesse Jackson to help him get the nomination. Or I don't remember if it's that or help get Jesse to get the nomination. But there was a lot of backroom stuff going on in the Tanner 88 documentary. No, that didn't happen in reality. But he was not the bad guy. He was the progressive hero in this documentary. So the brokered convention, the reason why it's so terrible now is because, well, one, we've become more and more accustomed over the years to a more democratic primary process, and also because of the popularity of Bernie Sanders. He really does represent something beyond status quo politics. It used to be you had an electorate that was mostly checked out. It was really mostly kind of a party affair. Who the nominee would be. People didn't check in. They weren't watching every primary debate.
Well, I think the way I like to describe it too is I'm just like, look, as somebody who, before the Iraq War, I personally wasn't, I wasn't really awake politically. Like when I was in high school, my concern was just playing in punk bands and whatever. I didn't really have opinions really on politics. And then the Iraq War happened. I went away to college. I read a guy named Noam Chomsky, and then the floodgates were open. And, to me, it was like, I never felt some kinship with the Democratic Party. I just realized, well, they weren't the Republicans. And, my point of view isn't necessarily reflected on the ballot, but this is, at least maybe a slower way to get to the type of society I'd like to see. And then what 2016 did, and I'm sure a lot of people were, cognizant of this before I was, but I think for 2016, for a lot of people, especially people my age and younger, and just people that maybe, had a similar perspective, 2016 just confirmed all of our worst suspicions. Like all of our worst suspicions about how our politics really works and about what the Democratic Party really is. All of our worst suspicions and then some were confirmed in 2016 when we went backwards. And for those of us who in 2008, we supported Dennis Kucinich because we knew Obama was kind of just a moderate and wasn't the sharp change we needed. But we were like, oh, okay, well, he'll push us in a better direction and then we'll get further and stuff like that. All of our worst suspicions were confirmed from 2008 to 2016, and then especially in the election 2016. And we realized that, if you're a lefty, the Democratic Party does not have room for you in their supposed wide tent. Who do they have room for? Anti-choice people like Tim Kaine. They got room for that, but they don't have room for you.
Yeah, I came out of I moved to Portland when I was 20, and I've been here ever since. And I kind of, for me, what made me break from traditional politics and become kind of a committed leftist was the first Iraq War, the Desert Storm in 1991, and I then saw Bill Clinton run against George Bush as someone who wouldn't outright condemn that invasion, which was to me an illegal invasion and an atrocity. And so it was as early as 91 where I was thinking, well, and watching Bill Clinton get elected, where I thought, well, this, the Democratic Party is not for me. I haven't voted Democrat.
Really? I mean,
election.
He played the saxophone and everything. That didn't.
Yeah, I know. There were a lot of people around me who were saying that, given that Bill Clinton was a black man, I should be supportive of him. But wasn't he our first black president? But in any case, I didn't like him. And then since then, I hadn't voted for a Democrat in any election except for John Kerry I hated George W. Bush so much that I wanted to get him out the door, and I held my nose for John Kerry and then felt really dirty afterwards. But but this time around, I don't know if I'm getting weak in my old age or if really Bernie Sanders is very, very different. I think it's the second thing. I've actually registered as a Democrat. So not only will I vote for him in the general, I'm actually going to vote in the primaries. Scratched out socialist, wrote in Democrat to vote for him in Oregon, even as I'm, talking, try to talk on my own channel about how we have to go beyond the social democratic horizon. Like I cannot stave off the Bernie bro position and the love of of this moment. So
well, here's hoping, man. I'm with you. So where can people go to learn more about you? Where can people go to check out the podcast, to check out Zero Books? Plug it all, sir.
Okay, well, look for us on YouTube, since you're already on YouTube, probably, or maybe you're not. Maybe you're on one of the dozen other video streaming services. But Zero Books on YouTube is the first place to stop. We also have a podcast called Zero Squared. You can Google that. Go to Amazon, look up some of our books like Give Them an Argument or Kill All Normies, or there's a really good book that was published before I started called Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. All those are big titles and will give you a good impression of what we do. And then read my book, Bash Bash Revolution. If you like science fiction, it's was picked by Gamer Magazine, I think it was called, as a pick of the month, and it's got good reviews in like Book List and Publishers Weekly and so forth. So Bash Bash Revolution is my novel, and there's all that stuff out there. Google Douglas Lain, Lain. See it spelled on the screen. All right.
Thanks so much for doing this, man. It was really cool to talk to you. And we will definitely check in again soon. And everybody, tour dates, I got them, romplacone.com. This Saturday, we're going to be in San Francisco. Do not wait. Get your tickets now. Go to romplacone.com for those tickets. Grandma Oda and myself will be in San Francisco. March, we're going to be in Florida, March 12th, Orlando, March 13th, Tampa, March 14th, Miami. April 9th, I'll be at Concord University. April 10th, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. April 24th, Seattle, Washington. April 25th, Portland, Oregon, which Douglas, I hope you can make that show.
Will do.
And of course, it's patreon.com/romplacone if you want to support this show on the sustainability level, which thank you, patrons, because without you, this series would not be possible. This is our second installment of the Sounds of Revolution interview series. Douglas, thank you so much for being our guest, and we will be in touch.
I enjoyed it.
All right. Peace.